Fernando, Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the University of New Orleans and Director of the Tocqueville Project. I'd like to welcome you to today's talk looking at issues in global justice. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to take a moment to thank the organizations that have made this talk and the other lectures that we do at UNO possible. Includes the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University, John Templeton Foundation, the Charles Koch Foundation, the UNO Department of Philosophy, and the UNO Student Government Organization. Today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Fernando Teson. Fernando is an Argentine-American legal academic who is known for his contributions to the law of humanitarian intervention and to the philosophy of law. He's the Tobias Simon Eminent Scholar at Florida State University College of Law. His publications include Humanitarian Intervention and Inquiry into Law and Morality, Rational Choice and Democratic Deliberation, A Philosophy of International Law, and many articles in law, philosophy, and international relations. Before entering academia, Professor Tesón was a career diplomat for the Argentina Foreign Ministry in Buenos Aires for 4 years. He resigned from that position in 1981 to protest against the human rights abuses by the Argentine government. And he also serves currently as a permanent visiting professor at UTDT in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Today, again, he is here to speak to us about issues related to global justice. The current global justice literature starts from the premise that world poverty is the result of structural injustice, mostly attributable to past and present actions of governments and citizens of rich countries. As a result, the literature recommends vast coercive transfers of wealth from rich to poor societies, alongside stronger national and international governance. Teson's conception of global justice, justice at a distance, in contrast, argues that global injustice is largely homegrown and that these native restrictions to freedom lie at the root of poverty and stagnation. Tesson emphasizes free markets in goods, services, and labor as an ethical imperative that allows people to pursue their projects and as the one institutional arrangement capable of alleviating poverty. Supported by a robust economic literature, justice at a distance applies the principle of non-interference to the issues of wealth, poverty, immigration, trade, the status of nation-states, war, and aid. And today he is here to speak to us about this theory of justice and justice at a distance. So please join me in welcoming Professor Fernando Tesón.
Thank you very much, Professor Supernal, for this very generous introduction. And I want to thank also the University of New Orleans and the sponsors for inviting me today. I'm very pleased and honored to be talking to you today. And thank you very much for coming. This project is a book that I published last week with Professor Lauren Lomaski of the University of Virginia. And it took several years, germinated, grew over several years of collaboration. And as Professor Supernant anticipated, let me just a little bit place the argument that I'm going to make in context. Political philosophy from about 10, 15 years, or maybe 10, 12 years ago, moved from the philosophy of the state, justification of the state, to a new area called global justice. All of a sudden, I think people started to realize that the principles of justice, whatever they were, are of global concern and not just national concern, right? And so a new discipline arose, and that some of the most famous, prestigious philosophers, political philosophers, turned to this new discipline, trying to figure out principles of justice for the world, for the whole globe. This literature, as I said, has a number of very distinguished and exemplars, writers and scholars. However, this literature, this body of knowledge, if you will, called global justice, suffers, we think, or I think, from a small problem, and that is that all think the same. So the whole literature, with no exceptions, up until last week, of global justice basically holds one view of what are the ills in the world, what are the causes of the ills in the world, and what are the recommendations, the best recommendations to address those ills in the world. And that is as follows, as Professor Superman already anticipated in the introduction. The main problem in the world poverty is the most important problem. There are other problems like oppression, but in one form or another, especially world poverty, is caused. The diagnosis is that world poverty is caused by actions or omissions by the world's rich nations or people in the rich nations. There are many variations on this. Some people think it's just a historical issue of conquest and imperialism. Other people think, like Thomas Pogge of Yale, for example, thinks that the present international system is a system that is unequal, actually privileges the rich countries at the expense of the poor countries, and that the poor suffer as a result, and they're incapable of exiting poverty as a result of these arrangements. So with some exceptions, one of them is corruption. They do recognize that there's local corruption. They think that the main problem lies in the inequality, if you will. Now it's a very famous word, now very not in fashion now, that exists between the rich nations and the poor nations, and somehow the rich nations, by perpetuating this, are the culprit, if you will, of this world poverty. As a result of this diagnosis, they make the following recommendations, basically two things. One, national institutions, states, ought to be strengthened in a good way. So they want, for example, many states and governments, as you know, are corrupt. So we should substitute good coercion for bad coercion. We should actually clean corruption and have good governments. They have to be strong in order to redistribute wealth internally to provide the services that the poor need in their own countries. So that needs a strong state, a strong welfare state. And also they recommend, superimposed to that recommendation for states, to strengthen international institutions. They say international institutions are too weak, and they do not do what they're supposed to do in the realm of wealth and poverty alleviation, which is to redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor. And in order to do that, we need a combination of two. We need strong, honest states, and we need robust, coercive institutions. Now, there's a lot of variation among these authors. Pogge recommends a global dividend of some sort. There's a huge global tax. Same thing, Thomas Piketty in his recent work. Same thing. Other people recommend even more, like abolishing states and having a world government that redistributes everything, wealth, and so on and so forth. So there are variations among them, but more or less they fall into the things that the solutions that I just described. In this book, we dissent with this. We dissent with the diagnosis, and because we dissent with the diagnosis, we dissent with the recommendations as well. So the diagnosis, or our diagnosis, is that the ills, most, not all, you're going to see there are important exceptions, most, not all, of the causes of these ills, and I will cite two, poverty and oppression, are homegrown. These are due to bad governance. Bad governance and both stagnation and poverty are due to largely to local bad governance. And oppression is due to local bad governance as well. As a result, then, the recommendations by the mainstream literature is bad recommendations because they are not asserting, they are misdiagnosing what the problem is. They don't think that states are the problem. They think that or the governments, local governments. The problem is the rich countries that are not helping enough, right? So our recommendation is, because our diagnosis is different, is the opposite to what the mainstream literature makes. And we basically, I can encapsulate it in kind of a catchphrase that I use, simply, leave people alone. That is our recommendation. Leave people alone. What that means, that sounds like a catchphrase, it's not very scientific, but that's just to impress it upon our minds a little bit. But that means basically allowing the poor in the world, everybody, but especially the poor, to participate in the global market as consumers and as producers. So eliminating the shackles that they have in the forms of excessive immigration barriers, excessive protectionist measures, government control of the economy, and political barriers, the lack of political freedom, the lack of human rights, the lack of political rights of vote, the lack of rule of law. All of those bad things are bad governance. It's bad governance. When you don't have the rule of law, it means the government is not respecting the law, the rules, right? And the citizens are at the mercy of the whim of those who are the rulers. So our view is a view that encompasses all aspects in which governments interfere with individuals' personal projects, right? Our idea is that, and I'm now on to the justification. So this is more or less the project that we have. So we recommend, just to summarize, now I'm going to go to some of the particular topics. We recommend lifting restrictions from people, not imposing more restrictions on people, right? Lifting restrictions of all kinds. I'm going to say in a moment what they are. I'll be more specific in this. So people can freely pursue their projects in life and flourish as free human beings, whether you're poor or whether you're rich. So first, let me tell you about the strategy that we follow, because this is what I just told you, of course, is a conclusion. I have not yet made any argument for it. So let me explain to you how our argument that we have, but throughout the book and in each of the topics that we address, we have a double argument, two arguments, because we think that the solution that we propose is what in philosophers call is overdetermined. So let me give you an example. Suppose that you say, okay, so you should not murder people. Now, why is that? Well, you say the reason is overdetermined. There's more than one reason. So one reason is like morally wrong, and the other reason I'm going to jail. So you're giving two reasons that are different. One is a deontic reason, the other is a consequentialist reason, but both of them converge. Well, same thing here. We have moral reasons to support a view, and we have also equally strong empirical reasons that support our view. Let me start with the moral reasons. The moral reasons have to do, as I said, the basis for our ethics, if you will, or global ethics, is the imperative to respect people's personal projects in life. This is a complicated matter, as I'm sure you know. It has to do with, there are some limits. For example, I have to respect your project, but if your project is trying to kill me, then I'll have to respect your project. Or if your project is to kill him, I have to respect your project. But there is a very rich literature, and in the Kantian lines, Professor Supernan works in this area, so he knows well. But the idea is that the people's peaceful pursuit of personal project is the core of interpersonal morality. And the reason is to respect projects is that there is no such thing, we think, as impersonal value. All projects are personal. So for example, if you want to do the pilgrimage to Mecca, that's your project in life. My project, and is that a good thing for you to do the pilgrimage to Mecca if you're a Muslim and you're interested in that? Yeah, it's a good thing for you. You should be allowed to do that if you want to do that. But that's not a good that is universal. That is, it is not a good to me that you go to Mecca the pilgrimage. So I don't have to subsidize you if you want to go to Mecca. But if I go instead to watch football in the couch with a six-pack, you have to respect me doing my football watching with a six-pack, much as I have to respect you that go for the subsidy. And you do not have to subsidize me, my football watching with a six-pack in the couch, right? So we actually live in peace, respecting each other's privacy. More or less, that's the idea, right? And in great part is because value is personal, the value of life, how you want to live your life. Now let me put it very briefly so you understand the ethical basis what we're talking about. In the context of poverty, So someone in Africa needs a doctor because she is suffering from malaria or something, dysentery, for example. That's some of the African. And I have, which I do, I have a 16-year-old daughter. You might think, how this old guy can, but that's a different question. And so, you know, my daughter wants to go on a trip with her friends. She wants to go to Italy this summer. This is true. It's a true fact what I'm telling you. She wants to go to Italy, believe it or not. Okay. So she's a very good student, very good person. So I want to subsidize her. So my wife and I have decided we're going to, yeah, you can go. I mean, there are conditions, you know, but you know, you can go to Italy. We're going to make it happen if we can afford it. You know, this is not a cheap kind of thing, right? All right, so there are philosophers, and this is I'm not making up. You might think, who says this? Well, many people say this, especially in the global justice literature, that it's morally wrong for me to pay for my daughter's Italy trip if there are people in Africa that are suffering from dysentery and need a doctor, that for less than half the money that I'm spending in my daughter's trip, I could cure someone in Africa. There are people who say this, seriously, and the global justice philosophers argue this. The reason we are not persuaded that this is morally wrong is that my daughter is my daughter, and this is my project, and this is my life, right? I wish well the person in Africa, and it would be a good thing if I have extra money to help, and I will try to help, but it's not required by justice that I help. That's very important for us. What is required by justice is that I not interfere. I not make things worse for them by interfering with their lives, right? We argue in the last chapter that aid is a good thing. We're going to talk about that in a moment, but it's not required by justice. What is required by justice is that I not interfere in the pursuit of their lives and personal project by others. See it in other words. There are other examples. I like opera, for example. Opera is not a cheap hobby. The tickets are expensive, right? And so for the money that I spend in opera yearly, I could also send it to Africa to alleviate poverty. Is it wrong for me not to do that? We think, I mean, this requires much more development, but we argue in the book that this is not right because opera is something that's important to me. It's part of my project. And I wish other people well, but it's not required morally for me that I forego all my personal projects to be on call permanently because others have more urgent needs or things of that sort. So that's more or less the idea. So what is justice? Justice is universal. It's not relative to the person. Justice is a system of rights that establish non-interference with the personal project of others. Okay, that's the moral foundation of our view, which is leave people alone. Right? But it turns out, happily enough, that our view on this is supported by a very robust economic literature as well. So the economic literature, I have to summarize it, it's very rich, it takes a long time to read it, shows unequivocally a correlation between free market arrangements, both national and freer trade internationally, and alleviation of poverty, and also growth. Right? So nations, I can give you if you want. It is last 2 weeks ago, the World Bank came with a study that is definitive, I think, the correlation between healthy markets and the reduction of poverty, and the correlation between freer trade internationally and the reduction of poverty. So that is the correlations, right? But the causal story is explained by a literature called institutionalist theory. Institutionalist theory is precisely the work by Douglas North, David Landis, and more recently to economist as Morgan Robinson in a book, Why Nations Fail, was very well received, that actually established all this literature, not just one book, that established that the cause of poverty is precisely bad governance. Bad governance for this purpose means violation of civil and political rights for sure, ignorance of the rule of law, but most importantly, respect for property rights and contract. Right? When you have no private property rights, you have no growth. This is established without, I think there's no serious debate about this. So as a result, we concluded the book, something that people, I mean, if you think about it, it seems logical, but when people read it, they're startled. And that is that whatever else you think, justice requires capitalism. That sounds bad. It says, well, it requires what? All these things that the capitalist, no, requires, but by that I mean healthy markets. Now, healthy markets is a necessary condition for growth and alleviation of poverty. It's not a sufficient condition sometimes. And also it might be accompanied, we are agnostic about what other measures might be accompanied, like having a safety net for the poor, like Denmark has, others. But it requires healthy markets. As a consequence, social economic systems like socialism, one called the Rawls defender called property owner democracy, is not simply they are inefficient. It's really clear that they are inefficient. This is something that nobody disputes. But they are also unjust, because they are systems that actually massively interfere with the personal projects of people. And for that reason, they do not allow people to start business. They don't allow people to enjoy the fruits of their labor sufficiently, and therefore they are unjust. This institutional literature then, in the book, we tested, we show the correlation in many ways. Is more or less this is the idea that we defend. So the two strands of argument, and one's moral argument about not interfering with projects, and empirical economic argument that actually recommends healthy markets as a precondition for alleviation of poverty. And I would point out once again that the mainstream literature is hostile to markets. It's hostile to the one tool that everyone recognizes will serve to lift people from poverty. This is, to me, incredible. I mean, when I started doing research for it, I just can't believe that these people will argue these things. But that's what they argue. Everything is about modifying markets. It's never about having healthy markets. And they recommend things like, as I told you, like property owner democracy, socialism, several forms of socialism, and so forth. This idea that global justice should be agnostic, they have this idea, not me, that global justice should be agnostic about whether a society is capitalist or socialist or something, right? That it's not part of global justice. I understand why they have that idea, because that is part and parcel of the international system that we've had forever in the world. I'm an international lawyer, so international law is agnostic between capitalism and socialism, for example. And the reason is historical, because you had the Soviet Union. I know you're too young, but I can tell you there was once a country called the Soviet Union. That country, in fact, was socialist, allegedly. And there were the Cold War, there were capitalist socialists, and international law, of course, had to create rules for peaceful coexistence, and therefore could not say something like capitalism is just and socialism is unjust, because the Soviet Union would say, well, this is a system that is already biased against us. Right? So there's this kind of sense of impartiality of the international legal system that actually led to this agnosticism between economic systems. But I think that the evidence shows that this is wrong, and that there shouldn't be neutrality between a system, political and economic system, that seriously invades the rights of people, and a political and economic system that, on the contrary, facilitates the pursuit of personal projects by people. All right, so this is the general approach, and there's much more that we say in the book on this. And I want to here now to apply it to a couple of issues, just to tell you how it works. And you'll see, when you see the issues, you'll see that there are some partial exceptions to what I said. Another exception is that the rich countries have much to answer for also, right? I'm going to start with one such issue, and that is immigration. Now, immigration is tough these days, you know better than I, for two reasons. Because of the European crisis, the refugee crisis that is going on at the moment, and also because, as you know, mysteriously, immigration is back to the fore in America and in the political debate now in the election year. I mean, a year ago, people had forgotten about immigration. Everybody's talking about immigration. These things about politics, nobody understands how issues come and go, but that's what's happening. So the idea is our idea is very simple. We think immigration barriers, hard immigration barriers, the ones where the country has complete discretion to admit or refuse people from the outside, are unjust. And they're unjust because they violate the basic right that people have, just as your right of free speech or right of mobility. If someone wants to move to Louisiana from Mississippi, there's no problem. You can move from Louisiana to Mississippi. Imagine if now Louisiana would put like borders, armed guards in the border, preventing the Mississippians from moving to Louisiana. That would be a violation of the right of mobility. So national borders, the presence of national borders does not seem to be a non-arbitrary reason, seem to be an arbitrary reason why we should by force prevent other people from getting in. So if two persons on each side of the border want to have a peaceful voluntary transaction, the immigration barrier that prevents the Mexican worker from crossing to Arizona to mow my lawn, I lived in Arizona for 17 years, then that's unjust. It's an interference into the transaction between the person who wants to mow my lawn and myself. I want to invite him to my property to mow the lawn, and the state would prevent him from coming to my property. So basically, from the moral standpoint, is a prima facie violation of people's freedoms and the pursuit of projects. It is much worse even when somebody in a poor country wants to move to another country where he thinks that his prospects and those of his family are going to be better. He wants jobs, he wants opportunity. I know about this. I'm an immigrant, so this is an issue close to my heart, right? The idea that you put people with guns to prevent somebody from crossing the border in search of opportunity seems to us prima facie there should be some presumption, a liberal presumption, if you will, or a freedom-based presumption. This is the moral case for immigration, but very briefly. There is the empirical case. Again, in each of the subjects that we have, there's an empirical part and it's a moral part. The empirical is even more blunt. I mean, the economist Michael Clemens has just finished research on this. The benefit, the losses, economic losses for having hard borders are about 100 times as great as the economic losses for having protectionist measures in case of trade. So that if that is true, again, I'm not an economist, I'm just citing his research, then hard borders might be about the worst invention ever in human history, as opposed to allowing free movement of labor, and when people were seeking the best and highest use across the globe, and that would maximizing total output. We are putting these artificial restrictions in borders. Okay, so the idea is that there's a prima facie moral case, and there's I think even more obvious economic case for softening borders. So let me, before you start throwing tomatoes at me for what I just said, I'm going to tell you, let's talk about the objections that people give to this view that we propose. Okay. Objection number one is that I'm going to consider only four. The first one is what I call democratic self-determination. The idea is that we're in a democracy in the United States, let's say, and we vote not to allow people in. So what's wrong with that? It's called democratic self-determination. We can hang out whoever we want. We don't have to accept any people. Well, the problem with that is that you don't really believe that electoral majorities can deprive you of fundamental right. If the majority say no Jews allowed, or no Asians allowed, or something, you would get outrageous, right? Well, why is this permitted? Right? Not allowing somebody who wants to move from here to there by law, that's electoral majorities having the authority to deprive you of what I think is the right of mobility, which is a fundamental right. Right? So that number one. Number two, and more importantly, it's not as if the argument, because some people like my friend Kit Wellman from Washington University in St. Louis, he says, no, it's like a club. You have a club, and you can, you decide who you're going to admit as a member or non-member. That's the club members decide. Right? It's the same thing. Well, there's a big difference. A club is voluntary. The state is a coercive entity. It's not voluntary. right? So the state has coerced us into membership, and then the idea that we are a private club is not right. So it's a bad analogy from the club to the state, right? Democrats, in fact, the idea of free association works in our favor, not in favor of their position, because immigration barriers interfere with my freedom to associate myself with the immigrant and with the immigrants. So in fact, it interferes with freedom of association, the barriers. The other argument, the second argument is, I think it's in my view, even weaker, and that is the conservative cultural argument of some cultural self-determination. The idea we have a culture here in America, or the Germans can say it in Germany, or whatever, and somehow the immigrants pollute or poison our culture, and so we cannot allow our culture to be degraded by these immigrants. That argument is false on many, but I think it is especially false because what is a culture? A culture is something, I think, is people interacting over time, and that is something spontaneous. It's something voluntary over time, where the cultures evolve and change. There's nothing wrong with that. Do you think America would be better off without Chinese food? Really? You would have stayed with macaroni and cheese and hamburgers your whole life? You're much better off because of Chinese food. And the Germans are much better off with the Turkish doner kebabs that they have from the Turks, right? So the idea, the economist, George Mason economist Tyler Cowen has a wonderful book about that, about how cultures evolve and how we should not be afraid of this cultural, the melting pot type of argument. So that's a cultural argument, cultural conservative argument that I want to reject. The other two arguments are better, arguments against softer borders. One is the argument based on that fears that the immigrants are going to free ride on our welfare state. So the idea is that, so we have, for better or worse, but we have it, a welfare state. We have a state that actually redistributes wealth to the poor, the people who need it, in a number of situations, right? And if we allow indiscriminate entry of foreigners, they put a tremendous pressure on the welfare state system. The system will not be able to respond to that, right? That's the argument. Okay, I have a number of answers to that, right? I think that put in those terms, there's a grain of truth. It has to be admitted that there is some important issues here. My first argument, in response, which of course you would not like, many of you will not like, well, that's too bad, get rid of the stupid welfare system. But, okay, that argument is not going to gain a lot of traction, I don't think. So let's avoid that. Suppose you have to keep the welfare system. But the answer is this. One argument is based on my own, I concede that it's not based on serious research. I haven't done the research. But I am an immigrant. It's based on anecdote. But allow me to do it, to make it. And that is, in my experience, I lived 17 years in Tempe, Arizona, very close to the border. And I interacted a lot with people crossing the border, right? As I told you before. In my experience, the typical immigrant is not somebody who's saying, oh, you know what, I'm going to move to Arizona to do nothing and live off welfare. That's not my experience. My experience, these are people who want the same things you and I want. They want to feed their families and to prosper in freedom and be someone in love and in life and allow their children to be better even than them, right? To prosper in life. These are, for the large part, people who want to work, who want to start businesses, and so on and so forth. I don't say that there are no people who are thinking, calculating. It's hard for me to think, but I imagine there's someone in Hermosillo, Sonora saying, yeah, you should go to Arizona. You know what? You do nothing, and the state comes and gives you lots of goodies. I don't think there are a lot of people. Well, maybe some, but I don't think that's the dominant psychology. But again, as I say, I don't have scientific support for this. This is anecdotal. But the other thing I say is this, and I think if you are concerned about that, nothing in our proposal says that you have to, when you let them in, you say, you want to work, be my guest. It doesn't say that you have to give them benefits. It doesn't say that you have to make them citizens. If you are worried about that, if you're worried about electoral blocks that are going to deprive you of stuff, or you're worried that they're going to be free ride on the benefits, then devise a system where they don't get benefits for a while, right? And then, yeah, try opportunity. Go work for the factory. Go actually start your pizza parlor or whatever you want to start, right? Be my guest. Create prosperity. Create wealth for you and your family. So there we don't have, because we're not policymakers in the book. It's a theoretical book largely. So we don't have more specific prescriptions, but we think it's a question of institutional design. And if you're worried about this question of welfare, there are ways that it could be done. The aims of a more generous immigration policy can be achieved with some restrictions on welfare if you're concerned about that. Let me address the last objection, which I think probably is the most powerful these days, and that's the national security objection. Right? That's a serious objection. And I take it, I'm a pretty much a hawk in foreign policy. I think we have enemies, and we have to be very careful about our enemies. However, I think that the problem in here is the apparent administrative inability of the state. I'm talking about mostly, for example, not Germany. My wife is German, and look what high level of sources that I have. Last night, I had dinner with my father-in-law that's visiting from Germany. That's my very qualified source of information now. And he's saying, well, they cannot, they let everyone in. He's very fearful about what's happening to Germany with all the Syrian refugees coming, right? Well, there are criminals. And okay, say, Dieter, what is the percentage of criminals, do you think? 70%. Well, that's absurd. That's even 70% of the refugees are criminals. I don't believe that. So, but they let everybody in. And he's right about that. The German authorities, because of the history, the Holocaust and all that, are fearful of establishing serious security controls to weed out the criminals from the refugees that are coming. And therefore, I said the problem is not in the principle of helping these people, which you should. The problem is that you are unable to weed out the good folks from the bad folks. And it is an administrative problem. I agree with those who are worried about immigration that we have to make efforts not to allow criminals, right? Or terrorists or whatever. But I think the problem of that is to have like Israel has a much better system. Have a system that knows much better. I don't know, I'm not an expert in security, how to do this properly, but that would be the idea. So I don't think, it's not an objection of principle, because I agree with the principle of weeding out criminals. It's an objection of implementation, I think. So, I have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to talk a little bit about trade, very briefly. So trade, I say this to my students, and they can't believe it. I said what I say is this: the country that enacts what is called trade barriers, like tariffs, quotas, bans, sanitary measures that are not honest, a number of barriers to trade, hurts itself. But people can believe that. No, Professor, that's not true. So it can be proved mathematically. This is not. It has been known for 200 years exactly, because I think David Ricardo published his book in 1814. So it's 201 years. It has been known that freer trade increases global wealth, national wealth, the wealth in each of nations, and alleviates, because of the reason, alleviates poverty. This has been known for 200 years. Yet, we hear politicians, both on the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, still trotting out things about protecting our workers, protecting our jobs, that are utterly false. We have a senator, former Harvard law professor, saying these things, and I'm sure she knows that she's lying. It's not that she's making a mistake. She's a tenured Harvard law professor, she knows, right? What she's saying about trade. So there is a very serious problem in the rhetoric of trade. That, I don't want to go into that because it's extremely technical here. The law of what is called the trade theory, it's called Ricardian trade theory, by David Ricardo. It's called also the law of comparative advantages. It's hard to understand. It is counterintuitive, because it tells you that if you try to protect this industry, you are hurting all the consumers in society, plus future industries that do not emerge because of the protection. So there is what has been called the unseen here. When you protect an industry, you help that industry and the workers in that industry. That's obvious, right? But you hurt all the consumers in your country, and you also hurt, this is most important, you abort new industries in that, so you stifle development and economic growth. I'm sorry that I'm being so conclusory, but this is something. So here, for example, also the protectionism is bad for poverty alleviation. And one goal of global justice should be to abolish barriers to trade. There are some exceptions, talking to my economist friends who tell me that maybe in capitals it's a little bit more difficult. Free movement of capitals is kind of too dangerous for a number of reasons. Maybe there are some wrinkles here or there, but certainly services and goods, free trade services and goods, I think is uncontested among economists. The only people who challenge it are interested parties who want to be protected and politicians who want votes. Those are the only people who defend protectionism these days. And unfortunately, we have those in the United States as well. I come from Argentina. Everyone is a protectionist there, but they win votes for that because people don't understand trade theory. They don't understand it. Someone who is unemployed in the suburbs of Buenos Aires does not understand that the reason he's unemployed is because the government protected this industry that prevented new industries from emerging, because labor and capital go to the inefficient industry because they are protected, they're more rentable, profitable, and for that reason he doesn't have a job. But that's almost impossible to see. It's very, trade theory suffers from a very serious rhetorical disadvantage. In this area, as in immigration, the rich countries have their part of guilt, because immigration, the rich countries put the immigration barriers. Also, the rich countries protect, they are more freer in trade than the developing countries, but they have protect targeted sectors like agriculture that hurts producers in developing countries. So that's another exception to the general point that I mentioned before, that the main restrictions to freedom are native. Finally, two words, I have 1 minute, one word about aid. In our book, we think that aid is something that is not required by justice, as I said before, but it is something that is morally worthy to do. So an important thing is part of the duty of charity, if you will, philosophically speaking. And then we take up the very rich literature on aid that shows that most aid that has to development that the rich countries are engaged in has been counterproductive. This is not myself saying it. It's William Easterly, Chris Coyne. Just consult the books if you want. And the main reason for this is because the aid comes mostly from governments, and it goes to governments. Government mediated. So in the book, and that creates perverse incentives on both ends. The government that gives the aid conditions it to strategic advantages, military advantages. Those who receive aid are the corrupt governments that have created a mess in the first place. And very little of it reach the people that benefit, the people who deserve it. And there's another general issue that the more aid you give, as opposed to if you give money to people, you prevent them from growing food. You create a disincentive. You want people in Africa to grow food. You don't want to give them money and not grow food. In other words, aid has a problem of a moral hazard, very serious, which is that if you increase the offers of aid, you increase the number of claimants. That's something that there's a lot of study about that in the literature. So I think with this I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for your attention.
So we have about 30 minutes for questions. If you want to ask a question, hit the bottom of the microphone, let the red light come on, and then ask your question.
Okay, so thanks. So I had two questions.
Yes,
the first is just in response to how you reconcile the two claims. One thing that you say, just general rule, is leave people alone. On the other hand, you concede that in many ways, richer countries have negatively impacted poorer countries in the past. So I'm curious, what would you have to say about how rich countries should rectify past
Very good.
Past injustices.
Very good question. Yeah.
And so I'm curious whether that ties into your last point about there's problems with giving aid and all that, or whether. But so the second question. So I'm an immigration lawyer, and I share each of your conclusions, your responses to the major objections. The one that I get concerned about, and I'm curious just to see what you think, is the idea that, well, as a sovereign nation, we as a people own the territorial land within the United States as property, and that as an incident of that property right, people are permitted democratically to decide, well, if it's a property right, to exclude people. So I'm just curious what you think about this line of objection.
Very good questions, both of them. Thank you very much. On the first question, the examples that you gave and the ones that I gave, let me give 3 examples of bad actions by rich nations. Example number 1, too hard, the immigration barriers are too hard and don't allow poor people to seek better opportunity elsewhere, right, in their countries. Number 2, they for example, they protect agriculture, the farm bill. They protect their economy to the detriment of sometimes of producers of poor countries. Number 3, let me add one more. In the past, sometimes now they invade unjustly and cause harm. All of those are instances of failing to leave people alone. So those instances are instances that the rich countries ought to stop doing, because stop doing that is leaving people alone. And I think, yeah, I am a believer in compensation. I think in appropriate cases, when rich countries or anybody has actually wronged somebody else, they owe compensation. Yes, sir. I think that it's sometimes very difficult to make it to operationalize that, to make it operative for a number of political and other obstacles, and a lot of time has passed. But I would warn on the question of compensation. I would warn on one thing: the wrong has to be a real wrong, not some of the things people invent. Like people say, for example, I live, as I said, I come from Argentina. Favorite sport of Argentinians that you tell on the street is that the Argentina is not doing well economically. They never do well. I mean, we are kind of wealthy, but we are messed up all the time. Favorite sport, playing the Americans. We are doing badly because they are doing, this idea that we are doing badly because something they are doing. So that's a kind of, just say, you guys, you know what, that's in your heads. You need counseling. You know, this is not a real problem. The Americans, if anything, are too tolerant of Argentine messes. That's an example. But in those cases where wrong is real, then yes, I've heard. Second question, a very good question. You said that the nation somehow owns the territory and therefore it can democratically decide to keep people out, so forth. I would say I'm going to praise you now, because that position is the position of a great majority of international lawyers and everybody else. I'm afraid that today you're talking to the wrong person, because I don't believe in any of this stuff. I don't think the government owns anything except what is delegated to it by the people. So therefore, I think there are only private owners of property, and the government is entitled, when it's entitled, to have some jurisdiction and regulate that land. But the analogy of the government as a property owner, I think, for reasons that is too long to go here, I apologize. But if you're interested, I can give you the link to an article that I just wrote on that, about precisely on this issue. But thank you for the example. Do you want me to call on people?
Sure, if there.
Or you want to come here? If you're there, you're not seeing who's going.
You can run it, but if,
I don't care.
I want you to say more about your response to Peter Singer, because I think there are a lot of people who are persuaded that in certain situations, when it's easy for me to help other people who are suffering, that I have an obligation.
All right. So we have I didn't include that because of lack of time. But the response to Singer that Professor Superman is talking about is to clarify this idea that I am entitled to spend my money in opera tickets, as opposed to I don't have a moral obligation to send it obligation of justice to send it to the guy in Africa, right? And so that's the response to Singer. Singer is a philosopher, a very good one, of Princeton, who actually thinks that we have that moral obligation, and we respond to that at length. But there is an exception, which is the exception of the child lying in the poodle. So if you're walking, taking leisure to walk in the forest, and you see a child lying in a poodle and it's about to drown, so that you can rescue him at no cost or very minimal, of course, that's an exception to what I said before. It would be unacceptable if you said, what's in it with me? That's his life and not mine. Of course we'd say that the child in the poodle is the exception. The kinds of things that Singer talks about is not the kind of child in the poodle. It would require of each of us to abandon our own projects, to be on call permanently, if you take seriously that argument, right? So I think that, yes, if it's a child in a poodle, if I actually can press a button, suppose, let me give you an example. It's a crazy example. Somebody brings like a button to me and says, by pressing this button, you save a person from Africa. Of course, it would be wrong for me not to press the button, right? We're talking about what Singer recommends, which is a very anti-consumerist position that he has. We have too expensive cars, we have too expensive houses. People like Fernando go to the opera too much. What opera or opera? What is this opera thing? I mean, we have to actually be on call all the time to try to save the world's ills. And we think that fails to understand what it is to have a life. Yes, sir.
So you talked about Mexico, kind of for the immigration policies for helping the poor people in Mexico. Do you think that the drug war, ending the drug war, would be a significant way of helping the poor people in Mexico?
Okay, very good question also. And I have to be very careful here because I don't want my answer to be misunderstood. It depends on what you mean, ending the drug war.
Well,
But that you mean, that's my opinion, although we don't talk about the book. I think decriminalizing drugs would go a long way toward avoiding the great part of the horrible things that happened because of the drug traffic in Mexico and the United States and elsewhere. Guatemala is horrible, Honduras too. Mexico is especially a sad case. It actually had done very well after the end of the Cold War, and then it sunk again because of the drug war, as you pointed out. So I think that is also, curiously enough, is bad policy by trying to not understanding the unwanted consequences of prohibition, which is all this tremendous crime. There are lots of studies out there that I'm sure you have seen that actually say, please end this senseless war on drugs. It's doing us much more harm than good. But the reason I said I don't want this to be misunderstood is because I am a big believer in that there is a difference between political philosophy and moral philosophy. So my views as a political philosopher is that I think about the proper role of the state, right? Personal morality is a different story. Let me give you an example. I think that cheating on your spouse is morally wrong. I really do. I think it's wrong. I know if someone does it or doesn't do it, I think it's wrong. And I think people would, I don't know what I think, but if you actually promise something to somebody in that way, it's wrong. I don't think the state should be in the business of trying to catch up adulterous people, right? I think being disloyal to your friend, like talking behind her back and talking maliciously about her, right? And lying to her is morally wrong. But I don't think the government should be in the business of criminalizing those people. So what I'm trying to say is that when I say drugs should be decriminalized, I have 3 children. So I'm in no way recommending the use of drugs. I think the use of drugs is bad for you, and I give speeches to my kids I've given on this, And it's difficult for a free market guy like me who believes that the drugs should be decriminalized to make this argument. So, but you agree, Dad, you think it should be decriminalized, so what is your problem? My problem is that there's a distinction between what I think the state should do and what you should do with your life. So I wanted to clarify that. If my daughter comes and says, Dad, for example, I believe in the decriminalization of prostitution also, of sex workers. I think it's like very, I think it's unjustified for a number of reasons to just decriminalize the act by the person who is the sex worker. So, but if my daughter, she's 16, comes and says, Dad, I'm thinking about, some decisions. I want to be a lawyer, a CEO of a company, or a prostitute. What do you think I should be? I want to say, oh, it doesn't matter. All of that is permitted. This is a ridiculous advice, right? So I say, are you crazy? What do you think? No, but I thought since the other day I heard you say you want to decriminalize prostitution. I thought you had nothing against. It's awful, actually. Don't do that. Don't try that line of work, right? So something to say that is a distinction. One should not confuse the two things. And when I say people like me say we should decriminalize drugs, it's a recommendation about what the proper role of the state is.
Back again. Okay. So, given your response to Singer, I'm curious as to I'm not trying to get you in trouble, I'm curious as to why you think so many people seem to support that position or some variation of that position, be it politically or philosophically. So separate it from academic philosophy, look at contemporary U.S. politics and look at the number of people that support, say, someone like Bernie Sanders. What do you think is at the root of that support, if it's as obvious as you say it is, that opening up the markets would fix these problems that they aim to address? Because it doesn't seem then like it's a philosophical problem in terms of what we want to solve. Right? The people on the right want to solve poverty. Bernie Sanders folks on the left want to solve poverty. What seems to be...
Well, you need to clarify for me, in order for me to answer properly. You need to clarify support for what you're talking about. You said Singer. Do you think there is vast support for Singer's position? Are you seeing many opera goers that actually are stopping going to operas to start? You're not talking about that. You're talking something else now. You're talking about...
I think there's philosophical support for someone like Singer. Now, I don't think there's practical support in that people don't do it, but I think you have a lot of people...
But you mentioned Bernie Sanders, now I don't know what.
Yeah, well, I think you have a lot of people, either in academia or otherwise, that when you present them with Singer's arguments, they say, you know what, I am blameworthy for not acting in this way, but I'm weak and I'm going to go to the opera.
Well, they might say that. I think we think that's wrong. We think that somebody who says, I'm going to subsidize my daughter's trip to Italy, that's the dream of her life. Instead of sending that money to Africa, is doing the right, is not doing anything wrong, let's say. I'm not saying she's doing the right thing, but it's not a question of justice. It's a person who's pursuing her personal projects, one of which is to make their children happy. So I think, yeah, you're right. There are a number of people, you're right. A lot of people, especially guilt-ridden academics will say, oh, Singer is right, but I'm weak, and I'm going to have dinner today at the Commander's Palace because I'm weak. Right, yeah. Okay, so what I would say to this person, I would say, no, you're not weak. You're doing what is something what you want to pursue in your life, and you're permitted to do it. You might be a callous person, but that's different. You are not morally required to send the money that you were going to spend on Commander's Palace to some person in Africa. So, okay, I thought you were talking about that. When you say Bernie Sanders, I think Bernie Sanders, I'm not following him or anybody else. I don't do politics, if I can avoid it. But I think, I haven't heard anything Singer-esque from him. What I've heard from him is a total and absolute misunderstanding of economics. Just had no clue how markets work, zero clue. That's what I heard. So, from what he says about things. So I don't know, if your question was, why do people support that? Okay, not the Singer-esque thing. Why do people support statements like, we need to protect our own, and protect jobs in this country, and not all these foreign products, and whatever he says about trade? He's actually taking advantage of the public's ignorance on economics. It's called, we have a book about that with European Scholar numbers of years back. it's called rational ignorance in democratic deliberation, which is that there are biases that we all have, and as I said before, trade theory suffers from a rhetorical opaqueness. It's very opaque for the public. The public thinks, yeah, why we should protect Detroit. We should protect our farmers, right? And they don't stop to think that by protecting farmers, they hurt many more in their own country, right? So it's the opaqueness and the unseen of the position that they fail to grasp. Yes? Yes, go ahead.
This kind of goes back to the Peter Singer standpoint.
Yes.
You don't believe that morally those who have privileges or more privileges born into, like, I guess just born in higher places, they don't have the moral obligation to help those who, like, they shouldn't make some of their personal projects that help those in need.
Oh, yeah, that's a very good question too, and we discussed that in the book. Mm-hmm. Someone who makes his or her personal project to help others, that's wonderful.
But that's it?
No, well, that's it. That's a lot. I think that actually, in fact, if you feel strongly about it, if you inculcate your children and others, people form like aid organizations and things like that. And that's their project. So somebody who decides to stop going to the opera to help the person in Africa is an admirable person. I wanted to underscore this. But it's not an issue of justice. The state should not force that person to forego the opera and help the person. You see the difference? Mm-hmm. So I'm completely sympathetic with you. I think that if we didn't have charity built into it, someone who has zero charity built into their character is a person who's objectionable. But it's not part of the political philosophy that we defend. I think the political philosophy we defend is, we wish you well, I'm happy to interact with you, you grow the food, I buy it, and we both improve. That's wonderful. And I can, if I feel strongly that I was born with a lot, plenty, and others don't, to make part of my project to give to others. That's perfectly good. And we're not saying, I don't want to misunderstood that we think that somebody who decides to completely ignore others is an honorable person. But injustice, what happens in the real world is that private charity is crowded out by the government telling you, taking resources from you, giving it coercively to others. So anyway, that's the idea that we. But by no means, I completely agree with you. That is, as you put it very well. I want to use the word privilege. Privilege sounds like something that is like dirty, or like you don't deserve, or something that you did something wrong, you should be ashamed of it. I don't like the word privilege. It's really abused, especially on college campuses. But if you're born with more wealth than others, more resources, and you decide to make it, you put it very well, your project to help others, that's phenomenal.
Other questions or thoughts?
Yes. Smile, you're on TV.
There we go. So sort of building off of her question, with international organizations, helping impoverished countries and helping people who can't feed themselves yet. You were talking about how if you increase the aid, you increase the number of claimants, and it doesn't necessarily help their economy if you're stepping in and interfering with them and trying to help them.
Right.
Well, I'd like to hear you say more about that, because I'm sort of confused as to where to draw the line, like as far as when should we stop helping, and when should we let them do their own thing? Another
excellent question, very, very good. I wish I knew the answer to that, because I do not take the position, and again, I'm not a specialist in the empirical literature on this, but I recommend to you, there's a very fine book from William Easterly called The White Man's Burden, about aid, and also Chris Coyne, Doing Bad by Doing Good, and they examine exactly the problem that you are talking about. From my survey, the problem is very important. So it cannot take the position that aid never helps people. That is ridiculous. I didn't mean to say that. I'm saying that there are cases, or depending on the number of circumstances, that you put it very well. If you actually start throwing money, resources at them, and you crowd out productive activities, you do not helping them to be productive members of society, right? That's very well studied. So what she says is, where is the limit? Because if some aid is okay, I'm conceding, but excessive aid is bad, where do we draw the line? That's what you're trying to say. Very good question. And I don't know the answer. You need to look at the specialist literature. But I will say the following thing, in addition to what I said, said before. What I said before was that what actually pollutes aid is that governments mediate. That's horrible, because governments are up to no good. In a poor country that is starving, you can bet that the main culprit is the local tyrant. In a country where people are killing one another in war, it's a warlord's fault. And you want to give aid to those guys? To the very ones that actually cause the problem. And the side of the United States, which is better than most countries, but we give aid, our government gives aid to Egypt based on military advantage, to this other one, if he votes with us in the United Nations, had little to do with helping those who need it, right? So it's polluted from both ends, from the government receives and the other one. So that's what I said before. Let me add one more thing. From what I gather from the literature, there are forms of aid that are much better than others. For example, things that have to do with medical emergencies, health, those tend to be much more effective than other things, like development projects. Development projects is a problem. When actually a bunch of people go from the United Nations to Tanzania and say, we think there should be, I don't know, you should like grow broccoli here or something, or should be this or that. If you would start doing that, those are much more iffy. It depends on the case, depends how you do it. The most important thing, as Easterly says, is to engage the local entrepreneurs, to create wealth. What people need to understand is that the great part of the problems of the world is not the distribution, that's part of it, of wealth, but the creation of wealth. You cannot distribute that which you do not have, right? So therefore, there's no problem with distribution in Gabon or whatever it is, if there's no wealth in Gabon, right? So there's a country called Burkina Faso in Africa. I was shocked to learn. They're called Burkina Faso. I never heard of it, but did a little quick Google or something. 90% of its gross national product, GNP, is French aid. How can you have a country? What is the viability of a nation that nobody's producing anything? All right? So I don't think that, I think that speaks by itself, right?
Questions?
Yeah.
So what about, okay, so are you familiar with La Guajira in Colombia? No, okay, well,
Remind me.
La Guajira is a region where they have the world's largest open pit coal mining. Cerrejón is called the coal mining.
Yeah.
And so they have, resources. There's groups of people that live around the mine who have gotten displaced because they want their land for their water, their coal, etc. So these people were totally self-sustaining until the coal industry, started getting bigger. And I personally went with a group called Wood is for Peace to go, witness the injustices that were going on. And their claim was like, we had everything we needed. We had our wealth. We were self-sufficient until our resources became polluted, until we got displaced. So in that case, and like you said with the productive projects or the development projects, like, we're talking to them about that, and it's like, oh, they're saying, oh, you should get a taxi, you should open a motor shop. And it's like, they can't, these aren't viable things for farmers, people who have spent their whole lives in communion with, like, their natural environment. Right. So in that situation, it's like, yeah, leave people alone, but what about the big corporation that's taking coal out of Colombia for Europe? What do you do in that situation?
All right, so I need to know more about that. Who had property rights over that land?
Well, it's the Colombian government that's, like, allowing this to happen. Of course, like you said, it's
but I'm asking the private property rights over this coal region.
Well, it was like...
If the reason I'm asking is, if it belonged to the farmers, the government said, I'm taking it out from you, I'm giving it to a corporation, that's a major violation.
Well,
right?
that's kind of what happened.
Well, if that's what happened, I rest my case.
Mhm.
That's a government that's actually oppressing people.
Right, yeah.
So the fact there's a corporation doesn't help. I'm not in favor of corporations. In fact, I don't like corporations particularly, especially if they are, like in this case, in cahoots with the government that dispossesses people. I will make just one little footnote to your excellent observation here, and that is that self-sufficiency is not a very smart goal for a community.
Mhm.
People get rich when they trade, and not when you grow in your, like when you actually live, do you grow your own tomatoes and your own parsley and everything? You want to have some chicken if you're not a vegetarian, and when you raise your chicken? No, you go and buy them in the supermarket. So we all trade to get, we cannot produce everything we need. So therefore you mentioned we were self-sufficient, but that's part of something that I, with all due respect, would like to push back. It's the idea that the ideal world is a world where nobody trades and everybody's self-sufficient. That is not a good idea. So it's not good for this farmer community to be self-sufficient.
Well, as a group, they're self-sufficient because they're trading with each other. You know, like
So no, there should be no trade with outsiders. You think?
Well, there's no outside because they're isolated in
I see.
in a rural area.
To go back then to the original question, I think that again, we are all better off by trading with everybody in the globe. Any government who takes property from farmers or anyone else who owns them legitimately and gives them to somebody else, that's called theft in my book. So I agree with you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, speaking on what she was saying, you're saying the free market is better for everyone. But you said you lived in Arizona. Let's say Arizona, there's a huge corporation that does landscaping and cuts everyone's lawn. And then right over the border in Mexico is different people subsisting on cutting grass. So the huge corporation just goes after all the borders are dropped, and you can go and cut grass over here, we can cut grass over there. So the huge corporation comes and just cuts now all the grass in this border town, and the local landscapers out of jobs. What say you to that?
I say that I, if it's my house, I'm the property owner of the house that I had in Tempe, Arizona, I'm free to hire whoever I want. And so if the people, the person from Mexico gives me a better rate than the big corporation, I hire the person from Mexico. That's what the free market is called. If what happens, and another very good question, because that allows me to show that in many of those cases, that big corporation in Arizona is in cahoots with the federal government or state government to keep the Mexicans out. I can assure you that. Because these corporations charge higher prices than the immigrants. The immigrants, in fact, outcompete the corporation. That's why they keep coming and people keep hiring. So my answer to you is, what I say to that, I am the owner, I say to the corporation, thanks, but I'm not interested in you, and I hire the Mexican immigrant.
Yeah, well, not in every situation would it be just so. If you are in a certain town in a certain country, for example, my people that are from Haiti. Now in Haiti, you can go and you can buy rice from a Haitian farmer.
Yeah.
All right, but if you have access to certain parts of Haiti, you can go into a Walmart and buy the cheapest rice you'll ever see.
Right.
Very, very cheap rice. Produced in a factory somewhere, not in Haiti. So that's what I'm saying. What do you say to that aspect of the free market?
I think people should be allowed to buy whatever they want as long as it's legal. That's my view. Yes.
I suppose the central argument that we keep dancing around here is, at what point do we draw the line between a large corporation and a state? Because at some point a corporation can become large enough that it itself can infringe upon the rights of individuals to create and operate businesses because they can compete unfairly. So where do we draw the line between one individual trying to work under the free market and a corporation of individuals?
I guess I'm not sure about the import of the question. The question is, the corporation you say is competing unfairly. What does that mean? It's actually coercing people or what?
Well,
I need more information. It's not that I'm against anything you say. I just want to know more.
Larger corporations have the flexibility and the manpower and the liquid capital to leverage the entire production chain. For instance, they can buy the fields, they can buy the workers, they can buy the transportation methods, and do all of this in bulk and undercut anybody. So basically, because they can compete at a lower price, and they also have the ability to operate on a smaller profit margin, because they operate in bulk. So a Walmart will always have cheaper prices than a small store.
Okay, let me address that. In order to actually compound what you think it might be my position that is dubious, let me tell you an anecdote. On Facebook, somebody was complaining about Walmart. I answered in Facebook, Facebook didn't say anything. I said, I think Walmart should get the Nobel Prize, peace Nobel Prize. I was being facetious. Why is it? Walmart, by doing exactly what you very well described, has put at the disposal of millions of working families goods that they were previously unavailable to them by lowering prices in the way you say. So yes, some mom and pop stores have gone out of business and so on, but that is a good thing. It has actually helped in poverty alleviation in many areas of the United States, thanks to the variety, quality, and price of its products. Do I like everything that's run for profit, of course? I don't have anything moral to say about them. I just was exaggerating the normal price. But that is something that is overlooked when people criticize businesses in general. The contribution that a more efficient production makes to the general welfare. Why is it that the millions of consumers who before could not have the kind of LTV that I have in my home, right, now can get it at Walmart? Why is the welfare of those folks not taken into account when corporate practices are criticized? I agree with you, and I'm pretty first of it. Any violation of human rights, violation of the law, of that should be penalized by law. I don't think the corporation should not be allowed to get away with things like that. But precisely what you describe, I would regard is the good thing about the corporation, not the bad thing. Yes.
So where would you stand on anti-competitive practices, and how can that be regulated?
I'm against them. I think it should be competition, and I think there should be antitrust law. I'm very, I believe in that. I mean, I'm not very strong with some of them. I go far sometimes, because I think that the free society should try to protect the market. Yeah, I believe in competition, free competition.
So
I'm not in favor of anti-competitive practices.
So there needs to be some regulation to rein in industries that get too competitive.
I'm not against regulation. I'm just saying that precisely what's interesting, that precisely what you described as something very bad that was happening, I think it's a good thing that was happening, which is to make make available to working families, not to me. I have enough money to go buy at swanky places, right? But to actually working families, lots of products at lower price. And that's why if you talk to the many communities that are silent because they are not in the unions, they're not in the activist groups or anything, are people who benefit from Walmart and go shop there. Ask those families what do you think. Yes.
That might be it. On that note.
Oh, all right. Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it.